It was the kind of race that would change history forever. A moment where the sweat, determination, and pure grit of a rider would shatter barriers that seemed impossible to break. The sun beat down on the track, its heat mixing with the tension in the air. Crowds roared from the stands, but their cheers weren't for just any competitor. They were for someone who dared to defy the odds. This wasn't just another race. This was a battle for respect, for dignity, and for a place in the history books. At the center of it all was a black rider, a person whose journey had been marked by not just the pursuit of victory, but by the unrelenting force of racism that sought to tear them down at every turn. The path they had traveled was long and filled with obstacles, but this race, this one moment, held the potential to change everything. The world of racing had always been dominated by a certain image. A certain kind of rider, a certain kind of person. For generations, the sport had been seen as a place where only a select few, often from privileged backgrounds, could rise to the top. But here, in the middle of this dusty track, everything was different. The rider, let's call them the underdog, was ready to prove that their talent, determination, and passion were enough to outshine every prejudice that had been thrown their way. But the road to this race had not been easy. From the very start, the world had been stacked against them. The whispers, the stares, the outright discrimination. Each hurdle seemed to push them further away from the dreams they had worked so hard to build, and yet, they kept pushing forward, despite the voices that told them they didn't belong. They knew that to make history, they had to fight not just for victory, but for their very right to be there. As the riders lined up at the starting line, the air crackled with anticipation. You could feel the weight of the moment, not just for the rider in question, but for everyone watching. The stakes weren't just personal, they were bigger than that. This was a moment when the world was watching, waiting to see if this black rider could truly prove their worth, or if they would be pushed back into the shadows of a sport that had never quite embraced them. The race began with a roar of engines, the sound of rubber meeting asphalt, the rush of adrenaline. The underdog, though starting from a position many thought was a disadvantage, fought tooth and nail to hold their ground. The competition was fierce, and the riders around them were determined to make sure the odds stayed in their favor. But the underdog was different. Every turn, every lap, every ounce of energy was poured into this one race. Not just to win, but to prove something far more significant. But what if, despite all the preparation, despite all the effort, it wasn't enough? What if the weight of history, the weight of racism, was too much to bear? Would this race be the moment when the underdog finally cracked under pressure, or would they rise above it all, showing the world exactly what they were made of? The tension continued to mount as the laps flew by, each one drawing the rider closer to the edge of history. The crowd, which had been unsure at first, began to shift. Whispers of respect started to ripple through the stands. Could it be? Could this rider, against all odds, actually pull this off? But the race wasn't over yet. There were still obstacles ahead, literal and figurative, that could destroy everything. As the finish line loomed closer, so did the final test. Would this rider finish what they started, or would the forces working against them prove too strong to overcome? Stay tuned, because this race is far from over, and the true story of what happened next may surprise you in ways you never expected. The track was more than just dirt and asphalt, it was a battlefield. And this wasn't just about the speed or the thrill of competition. For the rider, it represented every moment of rejection, every challenge, and every time they'd been told they weren't good enough. It wasn't just a test of skill. It was a test of their very existence in a space where they weren't welcome. This race, like many before it, was the culmination of a lifelong struggle to prove that they deserved to stand on the same track, under the same lights, and fight for the same prize as everyone else. Growing up, the rider had always felt the weight of the world on their shoulders. From a young age, they had been told that their dreams were too big for someone like them. There were always whispers, subtle comments, and sideways glances that reinforced the idea that they didn't belong in the world of competitive racing. The industry wasn't built for someone like them. Every victory they achieved, every milestone they reached, came with a heavy understanding that they were not just racing against others, but against an entire system designed to exclude them. But even with all the barriers, the rider never backed down. They found solace in the roar of the engines and the thrill of the race. It wasn't just about winning. It was about being seen, being acknowledged, and making a statement that could not be ignored. But the world they were fighting against wasn't just one of exclusion. It was one of active hostility. There were people in the stands who didn't believe they deserved to be there, people who looked at the rider and saw only the color of their skin, not the depth of their talent or the strength of their heart. And then there was the team, the support system that had been there from the very beginning. They weren't just a group of technicians and coaches, they were family. Some of them had been with the riders since they first started racing, and they knew exactly what it took to keep pushing forward in a world that tried to hold them back. They had witnessed the constant hurdles, the unfair treatment, and the little moments of victory that had been snatched away because of prejudice. But they also knew the rider had something special, something that transcended the bias that others tried to impose. One of the most powerful forces in this journey was the rider's mentor, an older veteran of the racing world who had seen everything. This mentor had fought their own battles, but when they took the rider under their wing, they knew the challenges ahead would be far greater. They were older now, their glory days on the track behind them, but they poured every ounce of wisdom they had into preparing the rider for the brutal realities of the sport. They had seen racism firsthand, and they understood what it meant to fight for respect. And now, in the rider's moment of truth, they were determined to make sure that their mentee was ready. The night before the race, the tension was palpable. The rider paced back and forth, their mind a whirlwind of thoughts. They could hear the voices from the past, the ones that told them they didn't belong, telling them it was all too much. They could feel the weight of the expectations on their shoulders, not just from their team, but from every person who had ever doubted them. But they also knew that this was the moment that could change everything. They couldn't let fear take over now. This race wasn't just for them. It was for everyone who had been told they couldn't achieve their dreams because of who they were. The next day, as the riders took their places at the starting line, the underdog felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. The track seemed to stretch out before them, a daunting reminder of the challenge that lay ahead. They knew the competition was fierce. They knew the other riders were hungry for victory. But they also knew that, in this moment, they weren't just racing against their competitors. They were racing against every stereotype, every bit of prejudice that had been thrown their way. The engine revved, and for a brief second, everything else disappeared. The riders' focus narrowed to the road ahead. They had trained for this moment, they had sacrificed for it, and they weren't going to let it slip away. As the light turned green and the race began, they shot forward, feeling the surge of adrenaline course through their veins. The other riders were fast, aggressive, but the underdog was determined. Every twist and turn felt like a fight. The track was unforgiving, but they were resolute. It wasn't just about beating the clock. It was about proving to the world that they belonged. But as the race unfolded, something wasn't right. The other riders began to push harder, their moves growing more dangerous. They were trying to block the underdog at every turn, cutting them off and forcing them into dangerous situations. It was clear they didn't want to let the underdog win, and it was more than just competition, it was personal. Some of the faces in the crowd weren't cheering, they were watching with judgment, waiting for the rider to make a mistake. And then, in a split second, it happened. A sharp turn, a miscalculation, and the rider was pushed off the track. They fought to regain control, but the damage was done. The race was still far from over, but now the rider had to recover, both physically and mentally, from the blow they had just received. Was this the end? Had the forces working against them finally won? Or would the rider rise from the dust and prove that nothing could break their spirit? The tension was unbearable. Every lap that ticked by felt like an eternity. The finish line was in sight. But so was the question, could the rider overcome the odds once again and take the victory that had always been so elusive? The stakes couldn't have been higher. The rider's heart raced, their breath shallow as they fought to stay focused. The crash had thrown them off balance, not just physically, but emotionally. They could hear the other riders gaining on them, feel the weight of their doubts creeping back into their mind. Every ounce of energy was now being spent just to keep going, to push forward when everything inside them screamed to give up. But then, something shifted. As they pulled the throttle and regained control of the bike, their eyes caught a glimpse of the mentor in the stands. They had spent so many years training, enduring hardship, and learning from this person. They had been taught not just to race, but to fight for what they deserved. And in that moment, they realized it wasn't just about the race. It was about every fight they had ever fought, every battle against racism, every moment where they were told they didn't belong. The past, the whispers, the cruel words, all of it flooded their mind, but instead of holding them back, it fueled them. The rider pushed harder, their body fighting the exhaustion, their mind locking in on the finish line. The other competitors had underestimated them. They thought the crash had broken them, that the pressure had crushed their will. But they were wrong. With each passing lap, the rider gained ground, slowly but surely closing the gap between them and the leading pack. They didn't just want to win, they needed to win. Not for themselves, but for everyone who had been told they couldn't achieve their dreams. The crowd began to stir, a wave of energy building as they witnessed the underdog's remarkable comeback. It was no longer just a race, it had become a symbol of resistance, of perseverance in the face of adversity. The rider didn't care about the jeers or the criticism anymore. They were racing for something bigger, something far more important than a trophy. And then, with a surge of raw determination, the rider took the lead. The other competitors fought back, desperate to retake their position, but it was too late. The underdog had done the impossible. They crossed the finish line, not just as the victor of the race, but as the symbol of everything they had fought for. The crowd erupted in a mixture of surprise, disbelief, and awe. This wasn't just a win, it was a statement. A victory against the system that tried to hold them back. A triumph over the racial prejudice that had haunted them for so long. As the riders stood on the podium, the weight of the moment hit them. This was the culmination of years of pain, of struggle, of being told they weren't enough. But here in this moment, they had proven that they were more than enough. They were worthy. They were powerful. They were a force to be reckoned with. The mentors stood in the crowd, a proud smile on their face, knowing that this moment wasn't just about the race, it was about something far bigger. It was about showing the world that no matter the color of your skin, no matter the obstacles in your way, you could rise above it all if you had the will and the heart to keep fighting. The riders who had once doubted them, they were left in the dust, their attempts to tear the underdog down exposed for what they were. And as the crowd continued to cheer, the rider realized that this was only the beginning. The race was over, but the fight for equality, for representation, and for respect was far from done.